Hi, and thank you for joining me for another video. And friends, this week's portion is Parashat Vayetzei. And friends, we're still in the portion that describes the intimate lives of our patriarchs for no other reason than to lay an ethical and moral foundation for everything that will come later. And one thing we must understand as we study the narrative, and that's that it's not the words or the statements or the actions done in these chapters that make this work so great, but rather the lessons and principles that develop throughout the narrative, especially here in this Parsha with the life of Yaakov, that truly reveals the signature of God in this work. And friends, the reason this is so important is because many, both in the Jewish and even Christian world, have gone so far as to adopt the erroneous conclusion that if our patriarchs said or did it in the narrative, that this in some way means that it's ethically permissible. Assuming that if someone within the narrative came from Abraham, that they can do no wrong. A notion, my friends, that has even extended to our present day. The erroneous concept of having no enemies from within. Nonsense, my friends. I would even go as far as to say that throughout Jewish history and even today, our enemies are predominantly from within. And my friends, I said it before and I'll say it again, that when learning Torah, especially in Parashat, before the laws were actually given, we're forced to go by narrative alone. And my friends, we must not forget the principle that in this area, context is king. In other words, it would be erroneous to assume that only because Yaakov deceived that we can also deceive, or because Sarah or Rachel lost hope with the Almighty's promises that we can in some way give our spouse over to someone else to procreate with. Are you catching my drift? In other words, people today have begun studying Torah the way the incompetent study Talmud. In other words, by just assuming because it's there, it's permissible, and not asking or even wanting to wait for the final outcome of the situation, or in regards of learning Talmud, the final ruling. Because friends, this is not the way the healthy relate to a good God. In other words, in our belief system, the means must always justify the ends. Meaning that what I do today, or in my daily walk in emulating the Eternal One, my interactions with the rest of the world must rationally and morally contribute to what I expect my final goal to be, for it to be considered ethical. Which is sad to say, not the way the Jewish world works today. That only because one rabbi somewhere may have thought it or said it, that in some way this gives us the religious right to emulate it. Nonsense, my friends. And this is an idea that really should be covered before we go any further in this Torah. And that's that, my friends, we are decent first and Torah Jews second. Because honestly, only a decent mind could begin to comprehend the purpose of Torah in the first place. Because if not, what separates us from the worshippers of, let's say, Greek gods, who only worship them because their God said so? No, my friends, gods like that we do not need and we do not want. And honestly, this is mainly what we see coming from individuals that were born from religious families instead of individuals who later found the truth in life. To the point that our sages even say that Derek Eretz Kadma La Torah, that decency precedes Torah learning. Now, don't get me wrong, being born and raised in a religious environment is absolutely the ideal. As a matter of fact, this is one of the responsibilities that comes with being religious in the first place. Being that earlier generation, teaching the newer generation these Torah principles. Not to mention, one of the main principles of them all, that each of us, you and I, must find God for ourselves in some point in our lives, no matter how we may have been raised. And then develop the gratitude of knowing how privileged we are. And then by knowing that, realizing how others lack and suffer for not knowing, which only makes you want to spread it even more relentlessly. This, my friends, is a healthy theology, and what the Almighty had in mind all along. Which is why the Almighty Himself not only commands us to teach this to our children, but on a yearly basis, relive this whole narrative, the whole Passover experience, within every one of our homes, so that we may never forget, and God forbid, begin to take the Almighty or His Torah for granted. So today, my friends, you have the opportunity while studying this portion to embody these principles for yourselves. Because, my friends, this portion begins by describing the dream or vision that Yaakov had on his way to Haran. In this dream, it describes him seeing angels ascending and descending a stairway that reached from heaven to earth. And it's during this dream that the Almighty reminds Yaakov that the land he is laying on is the very one that he himself will give to his descendants. Virtually the same promise he told Abraham and later told Yitzhak, with the old familiar phrase that through you and your offspring all the peoples of the earth would be blessed. So taking into account all the Parashat that we've read so far, we already know that even the promise right here that the Almighty gives to Yaakov is also conditional, as conditional as it was to Avram Avinu, later having to prove himself to the Almighty, and as conditional as it was for Yaakov's own father Yitzhak. And friends, here is where a little common sense must come into play so we are able to progress ethically within the narrative. Because we see that right after the Almighty speaks to Yaakov, Yaakov makes the statement that surely the Lord is in this place, and this place is none other than the house of God. This is the gate of heaven. And not only that, he even builds an altar there and calls the place Beit El, the house of God, a place that is even in existence today in Eretz Yisrael. However, meaning that those of us who know Scripture past Sefer Bereshit can confidently state that Yaakov here made a religiously immature statement, to the point that immediately after this we see Yaakov do something that no other patriarch did in the past. And what's that, friends? It states that Yaakov, in the defined state that he finds himself in, as someone who has just fled his home because of the result of his unethical actions, goes and places a condition before the Almighty. He states that if God will be with me and watch over me and feed me and clothe me and even return me safely to my father's house, then the Lord will be my God. And this stone that I have set up as a pillar will be the house of God. And I will even give him 1/10 of everything I receive. And this, my friends, is why Yaakov suffered more than any other patriarch. Why? Because he took the longest to religiously mature. And friends, this is a real question, because this is something many do even today by demanding from the Almighty. And if he doesn't deliver, they drop him, erroneously asking, where was God? Instead of asking, where was I? And this, my friends, is one of the main reasons that most Jews go off the derech nowadays, because we have birthed a generation of rabbis that has drilled the erroneous notion in the mind of every Jew that because they exist, that in some way they deserve. And when they suffer, it's always the other guy's fault, which would only naturally cause people to view the Almighty as unjust and not worthy of their attention. And this was even the thinking of those who survived the Holocaust, and even those who reside in the state of Israel today. The birth of the third reason. And what's the third reason? Well, friends, the Torah specifically states that when Israel suffers in the collective, it's always because Israel sinned. And when it prospers in the collective, it's because of their obedience. And the third reason was developed by Israel themselves, because it doesn't appear in the Torah. And what's that reason? It's the reason of anti-Semitism, a concept, my friend, that's antithetical to Torah. And this is why after Yaakov utters that religiously immature statement, is when he meets Rachel at the well and the whole ordeal with Laban occurs. Almost identical to what the Israelites received when they demanded meat from the Almighty in the desert. I mean, meat they wanted and meat they got. In other words, we see the Almighty made it so that Yaakov had clothes and he had sustenance, but at the same time had a 14-year nightmare, teaching us that doing good for its own sake is really reward enough. And we even see that Avram Avinu and even Yitzhak knew it, on how they followed the Almighty for the sake of goodness alone, because it was the right thing to do and not because of some reward or punishment, which is, if you think about it, the way people function, especially in the Jewish world today, on how people no longer ask what's the right thing to do, but rather ask what are we obligated to do. Because honestly, how can you build any relationship on such a basis, especially when you're going to claim that that relationship is accompanied by love? I mean, what if a man tells his new bride that I'm just going to give you what I'm obligated to give you and nothing more, right? That should be enough, right? Nonsense and bull crap. A relationship like that would never last. Because, my friends, when you love something, you want to give it the best and not the bare minimum. Remember that the next time you hear some Chabad rabbi tell a non-Jew, why would you want to keep God's instructions when you're only obligated to keep 7? It sounds smart, huh? And also, if you didn't miss it, in this Parsha, it also explains the dilemma the rabbis had in last week's Parsha, where virtually every rabbi praised Yaakov for his actions against Esav, and went as far to say that he even sat all day learning Torah. When right here, my friends, it states in this Parsha that the God of Israel was yet to be his God. And this, my friends, is why it's so dangerous to add to the narrative. And worse than that, to completely take something out of context and build a whole lifestyle around it. Remember that the next time you see people learning in yeshivas for their whole life while they send their women to work. And this, my friends, is not just the way we should learn Torah, but the way we should judge everyone and everything around us. In other words, we should never assume because someone happens to be the son of whoever, that person is intrinsically anything, as we just saw with the example of Yaakov here in this Parsha. And this, my friends, is something that we not only see in the Jewish world, but in society in general. The ridiculous notion of pedigree or yichus. A notion this Parsha confronts head on. A notion that almost all the Meforshim miss. And really makes us ask the question of who actually were the mothers of Israel. Because at least initially they were not righteous women. And many such, as in case of the concubines, were straight out idol worshippers. Now, this is something to think about very clearly, and it actually squashes the modern day notion that blood or ethnicity means anything in this Torah or in any meaningful area in our life. And also, we mustn't fail to mention that this narrative in the Torah, now in this Parsha, between Yaakov and Rachel, is really the Torah's first love story. A love that may have sprouted because of the similarities between Rachel and Yaakov's mother Rivka. I mean, if you compare both of their lives, how they both met their husbands at the well, and how they both had problems bearing children, not to mention that they both came from the same family. And this, my friends, really explains a lot. And then we see, after the 14 years of hard labor, we see Yaakov finally find his way. He begins to speak differently, to act differently. But he learned the hard way. Friends, I'm here to tell you that you no longer have to learn the hard way, which is why the Almighty, in His mercy, gave us His moral standard in written form. A standard that the patriarchs here had to decipher for themselves, so that we should not also have to learn the hard way, but rather could have the elevated privilege of learning just by hearing. And that's actually what makes and separates the wise from the rest today. The ability of learning without having to experience or suffer the consequence. But anyways, then friends, we see Yaakov wanting to go and make his own life, seeking independence for him and his family. And this, my friends, emphasizes on the importance of independence. The notion of being able to pick up in a moment's notice from where you are in your life and go where the Almighty wants you to be, so that you can be the most ethically effective in this world. And this is what we see Yaakov trying to do, but what he does it incorrectly. In other words, he picks up and leaves without ever formulating a plan of confronting his aggressor. So we see Lavan chasing after Yaakov, and the Almighty, in His mercy, not allowing Lavan to kill him, putting Yaakov in a position to confront his tormentor, making Lavan the first individual to sincerely repent for his actions in Torah, teaching us that when we confront our enemies, the benefit is as much for their sake than ours. So friends, if you're hearing me today and you're looking for something more in life, if you're looking for a path that leads to life and can help you prevent disaster from overtaking your existence, I want to welcome you to consider Torah Judaism. For more information on converting to Judaism, please visit doordea.com. Thank you.